Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching PhD Parent. As reviewed in another video, there's evidence showing that timeout from positive reinforcement is an effective approach for reducing behavioral problems in kids. And you can check out the link to that video down below. And if you're interested in how timeout tends to be implemented in parenting interventions, then I have another video looking at that. And again, you can check out the link down below. Now, one concern that's been raised about timeout from positive reinforcement is that it may result in harm to kids because it involves briefly eliminating parental interaction with them. So in this video, I'll look at the evidence concerning whether timeout is harmful. And I'll do this in two ways. First, I'll consider a study that's directly investigated this issue using archival data. And then second, I'll summarize the results of a review that address this issue with respect to kids most at risk of harm. So first of all, the evidence from the Early Head Start Research and Evaluation study. So the issue of whether timeout is harmful to kids was addressed in a study by Knight. The approach these researchers took was to analyze archival data from the Early Head Start Research and Evaluation study. This study involved assessing kids at 3 time points: when they were 3 years old, pre-kindergarten, I don't live in the US, but I think that would be around 4 to 5 years old, and 5th grade. Again, not entirely sure, but I think 10 to 11 years old. Now, a bunch of different outcome measures were taken, which focused on the health of the parent-child relationship, level of aggression in kids, and emotional well-being of kids. Now, what Knight did was create 2 groups based on how parents said they would respond to 4 different examples of misbehavior. For example, hitting a parent. If the answer to any of these questions was stick the kid in timeout or something similar, then the parent was assigned to a timeout group. And about 390 parents and kids fell into this group. Otherwise, they were assigned to a no timeout group, and about 1,000 parents and kids fell into this group. Next, to investigate whether timeout is harmful to kids, Knight compared these 2 groups in terms of the above-mentioned outcome measures. The idea was that if timeout is harmful, then kids who received timeout would do worse on these measures compared to kids who hadn't received timeout. Knight's initial analyses, and I'll refer to these as the unadjusted analyses, indicated that kids who had received timeout compared to those who hadn't did a little bit worse in terms of engagement with their parents at age 3, and a little bit worse in terms of behavioral problems, for example, aggressiveness and rule breaking, when they were 10 to 11 years old. However, the parents and kids were not assigned to the timeout or no timeout groups at random. And when people are assigned to groups in a non-random manner, then the resulting groups are likely to differ in many ways other than the difference of focal interest, in this case whether or not kids receive timeout. Thus, what Knight did was rerun their analyses, and I'll refer to these as the adjusted analyses, statistically controlling for a bunch of different things, including education level of parents, parental substance abuse, and other types of discipline strategies used by parents. And once these variables were controlled for, there was no longer any differences between the groups in any of the outcome measures. Thus, Knight concluded that there was no evidence to suggest that timeout was harmful to kids. So far so good, but there are some problems with Knight's study. First, the non-random assignment of parent and kids to groups. So it's good that Knight ran adjusted analyses that controlled for other variables. But a problem is that they were restricted to controlling for variables measured in the original study. Thus, there may be other variables not measured, which Knight ought to have controlled for. For example, whether the parents were together or separated. Now, you can never be sure whether controlling for these unmeasured variables would have amplified or dampened your unadjusted results. Now second, if Knight's study had produced a result showing that kids who received timeout did worse than kids who didn't, in terms of one of the outcome measures, let's say aggressiveness, then you would be not entitled to jump around saying, hey look, timeout is bad. And here's why. Suppose parents are more likely to start using timeout if their kid is aggressive. What you would have ended up with in Knight's study was an uneven distribution of aggressive kids across the 2 groups, such that there would be more aggressive kids in the timeout group compared to the no timeout group. So you would find that the 2 groups differ in terms of childhood aggressiveness, but this would not have been caused by timeout. Third, as mentioned, the assignment of parents and kids to the timeout group was based upon parents' answers to questions concerning what the parent would do in response to each of 4 different examples of misbehavior. Parents gave these answers when the kid was 3 years old, and there are several problems with this. A big issue is that, at least as far as I can tell, parents were not provided with a definition of timeout. And so it was up to them to determine whether they used this strategy based upon whatever understanding they had of it. This is not a good thing. Probably without exception, you want to provide participants with a definition of any key terms, concepts, or in this case, parenting strategies. And you want participants to base their responses on the provided definition. If you don't do this, then the results of your study become, at best, difficult to interpret and at worst, meaningless. Another problem was that because Knight based assignment to group upon parental responses when kids were 3 years old, if a parent decided to start using timeout after the child turned 3, then they would have been inappropriately assigned to a no timeout group, when they instead should have been assigned to the timeout group. A third problem is that there would be considerable variation in the frequency with which parents administered timeout. In principle, the timeout group could have comprised parents who had used timeout only once in their child's life, and other parents who used timeout multiple times a day for many years. Such variation, which is not accounted for by Knight, would likely have a major impact on any potential harm resulting from the use of timeout. And finally, the assignment to group was based on 4 examples of problematic child behavior that could result in a parent using timeout. The problem with this is that, suppose you have a parent who uses timeout, but who has a child that does not show any of the behaviors described in the 4 examples, and so says they don't use timeout. This parent would have been inappropriately assigned to the no timeout group by Knight, when they should have instead been assigned to the timeout group. Now I could probably go on, but that'll do. So to repeat, the study by Knight did not reveal any evidence to suggest that timeout is harmful to kids. However, given the problems with this study, I don't reckon it provides a rigorous test of whether timeout is harmful. In saying this, I'm not suggesting that a future study which overcomes these problems would yield evidence that timeout is harmful. The results of such a study could produce exactly the same conclusion as Knight. I'm only suggesting that the Knight study does not provide confidence in the conclusion. So now on to the evidence from a review of parenting intervention studies. So Dadds and Tully addressed the issue of whether timeout is harmful in a review article where they focused on kids with a trauma history, specifically a history of abuse and neglect, as they suggested that much of the concern about timeout has been driven by the possibility that the use of timeout with such kids could potentially be harmful. These researchers concluded that there's no evidence to suggest that timeout is a harmful parenting strategy for kids with a trauma history. And in the following, I'll just briefly discuss the rationale for this conclusion. Dadds and Tully focused their review on studies that involve the delivery of parenting interventions that include timeout as a parenting strategy, for example, parent-child interaction therapy, when this intervention has been delivered to kids with a trauma history. Now, these studies show that such interventions can lead to a reduction in the reports of abuse, damaging parenting practices, and negative attitudes about parenting, while also producing improvements in child behavior and emotional well-being. Of most relevance, Dadds and Tully point out that no harmful effects of these interventions have been reported in these studies. Now, if you wanted to criticize the conclusion of Dadds and Tully, here's one way you could go about it. So the problem is that Dadds and Tully relied upon outcomes from research in which parenting interventions are being delivered. Timeout is only one of the many different parenting strategies that make up a typical parenting intervention. Thus, in principle, timeout might be harmful, but the other parenting strategies used in the intervention may wipe out these damaging effects, such that when you look across the intervention as a whole, you don't see any harm being produced. Now, what you would really want to do to determine whether timeout is harmful would be to look at studies in which timeout has been the only parenting strategy used. So you could look at the randomized controlled trials discussed in another video, and you can check out the link to that video down below. However, these studies did not involve kids with trauma histories, so fair enough that Dadds and Tully didn't look at them. At any rate, consistent with Dadds and Tully, no harmful effects of timeout were reported in these studies. But to be fair, it's not clear that the researchers were actively looking for harm, and the studies tended to involve administration of timeout within the lab on only 1 or 2 occasions, so perhaps not the conditions under which harm might emerge. So in summary, notwithstanding the criticisms of the research discussed, the conclusion stands that, to date, there is no evidence to suggest that timeout from positive reinforcement is harmful. Thus, any claim to the contrary is necessarily speculative. So that's it for the evidence concerning whether timeout from positive reinforcement is harmful. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.